what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning. Welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this Sunday morning. It's been another tough week for Rishi Sunak and the government. He lost his Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, who resigned, calling the government's new Rwanda bill a triumph of hope over experience. He faces a key vote in the Commons on Tuesday. Will MPs back his Rwanda plan to stop the boats? We've got a top array of guests here to talk to you about it all and to talk us through all of the different finer details. I'm going to be joined by Levelling Up Secretary and Housing Secretary Michael Gove. Just how damaging was that Robert Jenrick resignation for the government? We'll also get a Labour view from the peer and former Minister Lord George Fawkes. I'll be joined by former Tory leader Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. His think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, has just published a new report out warning that Britain is broken post-pandemic. We'll, of course, be getting his thoughts on Rwanda too. We'll also get the view from a backbench Tory, Dr Luke Evans. He's celebrating a win this week because the supermarket chain Morrison's is launching a Buy British campaign on the back of a campaign that he led. They're going to be labelling all of the food that comes from Britain so that customers know that it's been farmed locally, so to speak. He's also a familiar face to GB News viewers, Dennis McShane. He's going to come in and talk to us about a new book that he's written about the first term of Tony Blair's government. So he'll be taking us back to 1997 and we'll be seeing whether Sir Keir Starmer can repeat the glory of those days. Now, as you can imagine, it's been a pretty busy weekend for the newspapers. I mean, there's some quite astonishing stories in some of the Sunday papers that we're going to talk through now with Martin Townsend, the former Sunday Express editor, who I worked with for 15 years. Martin, lovely to see you this morning. I mean, let's just kick off with a kind of story that gives us the overview of what Rishi Sunak is facing this week over Rwanda. Page 2 of The Sun, the headline is Rwanda rebels snub Rishi's plea. And it's talking about the different challenges the Prime Minister faces over this policy that a little bit, you know, sort of like a dinghy in the channel, he's clinging on to for dear life. But one wonders whether this is just a fool's errand. I mean, it's not getting him anywhere politically, this, is it?
No, I think it is a fool's errand. I think it was never a practical plan, frankly. I think the principle is correct. We don't want illegal immigrants thinking that they can come here and settle, and you know, they should be moved on. And it's a problem, but it's a problem for the whole world. It's a global problem. Yeah. As ever, I think Britain is leading the way on this in trying to find a way to do it, but this is not the way to do it. And I'm afraid it's dragging the Tory party down. I can't see why at the moment they're allowing it to just descend into a legal battle that actually is boring the public. I think the public are bored with it. They've had enough of it. And actually, they're not addressing the real issues that they should be addressing at the moment in order to try and claw back some votes and you know, hopefully win the election.
I mean, the electorate clearly does care about migration, both legal and illegal, and expects a Tory government particularly to do something about it. So we can see the politics behind a pledge to stop the boats and bring the legal numbers down. However, and I know you now work in PR, from a PR perspective, I thought that emergency press conference in the week where he's already on the ropes and then he puts himself in a position where he allows my GB News colleague Chris Hope, as political editor, to basically put a question to him and say, this policy is a joke and you're a joke, aren't you, Prime Minister? I mean, this is bad politics.
It's terrible politics, and it's been really badly managed from a communications point of view as well. You know, and that's a classic example of it. The problem is he cannot win. He really cannot win with this. He can't. He doesn't want to make it tough enough that it actually would work. So he's alienating the right wing of his party anyway.
Yes.
You know, Parliament should, let's be honest, Parliament should trump the will of the ECHR. It should.
Yes.
That's what it should do. It has the right to do it, and it should do it. But to try and do that now, before an election, even if the election's at the end of the year, we're still going to be arguing the legalities of it at a time when Labour are just sitting back and just enjoying the fight.
Yes.
And the Tories need to be taking that fight to them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we don't know what on earth Keir Starmer would do about any of these issues.
He wouldn't do anything. He literally wouldn't do anything. And people actually deep down know that.
Yeah.
He's not interested in doing anything about it.
Having said that, I mean, regardless of whether Labour have come up with an alternative or not, and they have adopted this kind of policy of being a silent assassin, there's polling, or at least the pollster John Curtis, who obviously is sort of country renowned for being pretty spot on when it comes to his predictions. He's saying that there could be a complete wipeout at the next general election for the Tories, that it could be the worst election result ever. They could win just 130 seats. I'm trying to remind myself what they won in 97. I think it was 162. So worse than 97. 165, I'm told in my ear by my producer. So that could be absolutely catastrophic for them.
Yeah, it could. And to be honest, the writing's on the wall for them. I mean, they squandered a fantastic majority from 2019. Totally squandered it. Boris completely squandered it. For me, never to be forgiven for doing that, frankly.
I mean, do you believe that prediction?
No, well, I don't tend to believe polls, if I'm honest. I think polls are... Because ultimately, when people get to the election box, they're going to always vote with their pockets. That's the way I view it. People get to the election and they're going to say, right, which of these parties is going to actually put more money in my pocket, is going to make my family feel more secure, etc., etc. That's what they do. So whatever people are saying now, in the heat of the moment, with all these rows going on, with all of these ministers resigning and all of the scandal around
is anyone actually paying much notice to all this? They're out doing their Christmas shopping.
They're out doing their Christmas shopping.
But they've got the overall feeling of shambles.
Absolutely, and they're noticing how expensive everything is. They're trying to heat their homes. There's people freezing out there. And actually, the Tories are in this kind of... They're just fighting amongst themselves. It's like an echo chamber.
I mean, it was ever thus. Oh, the Prime Minister can't be too tough with this legislation because he doesn't want to alienate the Tories on the so-called left of the party. If he's too tough, he keeps the righties happy, but they're unhappy. It's like he talks about this broad church. I mean, he's a vicar trying to preach to a congregation, basically practising different religions.
Yeah, he is. And at the same time, I mean, it is plus de change, but it's also... There's very rarely been a situation where the Labour Party itself looks so weak. The Labour Party at the moment has... Nobody knows what Keir Starmer stands for. He's not particularly popular. It's a brilliant time for the Tories to be attacking Labour and saying, well, what would you do about this? What would you do about that?
Take the fight to Labour.
Take the fight to Labour, because if Labour win the election, God forbid, but if they do, we know what's going to happen. Everybody's going to pile in wanting, the public sector to be, masses of money to be put into the public sector. There's no money there.
The pay rises left, right and centre.
Exactly.
Let's talk about, you mentioned the B word there. Let's talk about my GB News colleague, Boris Johnson, and my other GB News colleague, Nigel Farage.
Yes.
Because there is a story in the Mail on Sunday suggesting that some Tory MPs are in a, quote, dramatic plot to bring back Boris as the only way to avert this electoral wipeout. And could he be on a dream ticket with Nigel? I mean, that's what I'm saying. I find the papers quite extraordinary this morning. Are we actually serious? I mean, first of all, bring back Boris. Your reaction, Martin?
Why? Why? I mean,
because he's a good campaigner and he can probably win more votes than Rishi Sunak, arguably.
But what happens when he wins that majority?
Yeah, no,
People have already seen.
And what do you make of this whole idea? I don't understand the rhetoric around Nigel joining the Tories. Surely Nigel, if he really wants to pack a political punch, needs to go back at the helm of reform, with apologies to my other GB News colleague, Richard Tyson.
Yes, he does.
And take on the Tories directly. I mean, I appreciate the argument about that just splits the vote on the right and it goes to Labour, but in opposition, I don't really know what Nigel Farage can do in the Tory party in opposition, really.
No,
I suppose take the fight to Labour, as you've suggested.
Yeah.
I just don't know how credible that whole plan is.
It's completely incredible, and I don't believe a word of it, and I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think, frankly, you're completely right. Farage, Richard Tyson's a very nice man, but he's nowhere near as popular as Nigel Farage is.
Yeah.
He needs Farage in the Reform Party at the moment, not in the Tories.
Yeah, but the Reform Party could be a real force to be reckoned with.
Yes, I think it could, yeah.
And I think somebody had once said at CCHQ, if Reform get to 10%, we are a word beginning with F. And now they're polling at around, I think, 11, or that seems to be the Westminster intention, that people are moving to reform in their droves.
Yes.
Let's change gears and talk about the royals at Christmas.
Yeah.
Now, we've had a photograph of the Cambridges, as they once were known, now the Prince and Princess of Wales, and their 3 children, Charlotte, George and Louis. It's a black and white image. It's their Christmas shot. They're all in kind of matching shirts. It's called a Christmas cracker on the front of the Sunday Tell. It's covered in all the papers, but what do you make of this image?
I just really don't like it.
Oh.
I just think it's completely miserable. I mean, they look...
Is it? They look smiley. They look lovely and smiley.
They're lovely and smiley. I just don't understand why anyone would put a mono photograph. Only those people in Montecito would think of putting a black and white photograph out at Christmas. I think.
And you are speaking as a former magazine editor,
I am.
because you used to edit OK, so you like glossy images.
I think at Christmas people want colour. They want, you know, that.
Do we want them in Christmas jumpers? Just be honest.
I don't particularly, because I'm not a big fan of Christmas jumpers.
Right.
I want to see a happy family, but I want to see a bit of brightness and colour.
All right. So you should have done a colour image.
We're living in a very black and white times at the moment, you know, out there in the big old world. To a certain extent, the royal family have to understand that they are part of escapism to a certain extent.
No, OK, fair enough.
And I think that should
Colour images, please, royals.
Yes,
colour
please.
images.
Yeah.
Finally, I do want to ask you, as a former national newspaper editor, about this story on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. Ex-MI6 boss warns of security risk in Abu Dhabi telegraph bid. That's Sir Richard Dearlove saying, basically, to the government, you've got to stop this. Briefly, what's your view on it, Martin?
Fantastic intervention by Dearlove. This should be a much, much bigger story. This is a huge story for Britain at the moment. If we allow a newspaper to be owned by the UAE or any other overseas territory with that kind of record on you know, the public...
freedom of speech and expression, yeah.
Then we are totally lost. Owners will always try and influence the paper. I mean, this has been going on for decades. This is always what happens. The idea that they're not going to try and influence the paper is for the birds. They will. Yeah. And we cannot allow that to happen with a regime like that.
I should say, in defence of the bid that's been made by Redbird IMI, they insist that they will adhere to journalistic neutrality and that they won't try and influence the tone of the paper or indeed the stories. It should also be pointed out, as we're covering this, that Paul Marshall, who has a stake in this channel, GB News, is also trying to make a bid for the Telegraph. But it's obviously quite worrying times for that newspaper, which I write for as well.
Indeed.
Martin Townsend, been a pleasure as ever to speak to you this morning. Thank you very, very much indeed for your insights. Well, as I've already billed, up next I'm going to be speaking to Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary. I want to find out what he thinks about the Rwanda bill, which has been, well, heavily criticised by Robert Jenrick, who put the legislation together, so he must know something about it. But we'll be asking Mr Gove whether this legislation can get through on Tuesday, and indeed whether the Conservatives are facing the electoral wipeout that Sir John Curtis predicts. All that after the weather.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, welcome to your latest GB News weather. I'm Ellie Glazier. Low pressure still very much in charge of our weather, bringing some spells of wet and windy conditions moving in from the west. This one in particular spreading its way north and eastwards as we go through this morning. This bringing some very heavy rainfall to parts of Wales, southwest England, and then spreading into northern England and Scotland later. This rain falling on some already very saturated ground, so we could see some localised flooding through Sunday. Despite that rain, though, across northern parts of the UK, there will be some brightness across parts of Wales and southwest England, where temperatures likely to reach around 13 or 14 degrees. But with a strong southwesterly wind, that will take a notch off those temperatures. Through Sunday evening, further rain pushes in from the west, particularly across Northern Ireland, into Wales and northern England as we head through the early hours of Monday morning. Again, this rain falling on that very saturated ground, so some localised flooding possible. There will be some clear skies around, particularly across the southern half of the UK, where temperatures around 7 or 8 degrees. But under all that cloud and rain, temperatures dropping around 2 to 4 degrees here. A cloudy start for many of us on Monday, and quite a wet start across parts of Scotland too. Rain continues to push in from the east, perhaps turning wintry over any hills of Scotland. But the best of the sunshine on Monday, definitely across parts of Wales and southern England. Temperatures here a little bit above average for the time of year, around 10 to 12 degrees, but across parts of Scotland, generally around average in the mid to low single figures.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. We're just waiting for Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, to be ready to speak to me. Before we do that, I'm going to bring Martin Townsend back into the conversation. I mean, we were talking earlier, Martin, about the idea that the electorate isn't really listening to any of this kind of noise around Rwanda. In general, what's your evaluation of Rishi Sunak's premiership so far? I mean, I know you were disappointed because you voiced it earlier on the sofa about Boris Johnson squandering this golden opportunity, basically, for the Tory party to try and change things and try and make Britain better post-Brexit. I mean, Rishi Sunak steadied the ship, but that lack of kind of charisma, character and maybe a degree of courage is proving to be his undoing.
To a certain extent it is, but I think, to be honest, Rishi Sunak has done a brilliant job in steadying the ship.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, there's a bit that the...
I'm going to leave it there, Martin, because Michael Gove is now ready. Sorry to interrupt you. Mr Gove, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Let's talk about the Rwanda plan. I'm sure you're expecting a question or two on it. We've had quite the headlines this morning, Mr Gove. We've got Professor John Curtis predicting that the Tories are going to be wiped out of the next general election. They may be reduced to 130 seats. We've got talk in the Mail on Sunday, would you believe, of a Boris Johnson comeback and a dream ticket with Nigel Farage. We've got Robert Jenrick having said this morning that he thinks that the government's Rwanda plan is simply for show and not for real, that it won't do anything to block individual appeals. It's dark days for the Tory party and your government, isn't it, Mr Gove? Nothing's going to plan.
Well, there's certainly a lot in the Sunday newspapers, and Martin, I think, was reviewing them with consummate skill earlier. But my role as a minister is not to provide further political commentary, is to get on with the job. And the Rwanda legislation that you mention is very important. It's a robust bill which will ensure that we can deport people to Rwanda because it's a safe third country, and that will be inordinately helpful in making sure that we can safeguard our borders and deliver the migration policy that the country wants to see.
But it is problematic, isn't it, that of course there is legal disagreement on this. And while I appreciate that lawyers are paid to disagree and disagree heavily, on one hand you've got the likes of Lord Sumption saying they're happy with the legislation. On the other, you've got the Star Chamber of government lawyers saying, and indeed the government's own lawyer, James Eadie, saying that they're only half convinced that the legislation is actually going to be robust enough. James Eadie, who's the most senior government legal counsel, says there's a 50% chance that the European Court in Strasbourg will still interfere and issue an interim injunction to stop any flights to Rwanda. So this kind of summarises the problem, doesn't it? There's always going to be lawyers that are able to argue against this plan. And if the legislation isn't full fat, if it is weak, as Robert Jenrick has said, I mean, he's resigned on the issue, then it isn't fit for purpose.
This legislation is absolutely robust. There are all sorts of milk metaphors out there. This is Jersey gold top legislation because it is very clear that the basis on which people resisted being sent to Rwanda in the past, the justifications that were used then, will no longer apply. And I think the legal consensus is, particularly from people who have themselves sat on the Supreme Court, like Jonathan Sumption, that this legislation will ensure that there will only be a vanishingly small number of cases for individuals being able to resist being deported.
OK, so if you think it's robust and that it's Jersey gold top, can you give us a guarantee then that the European Court in Strasbourg won't be able to issue an interim injunction to stop flights to Rwanda? If you think it's robust enough, you must be able to give us that guarantee here. Now, a gold top guarantee from you, Mr Gove.
It is clear that ministers will reserve the right to decide if there are these injunctions from the European Court, how to respond. And we are making it very clear in domestic legislation that Parliament's priority is to ensure that deportations can proceed. And it's important to recognise that the only way in which a deportation could not proceed is if someone was in imminent risk of serious and irreversible harm as a result of this deportation. That is a very high bar. I think every lawyer would agree.
But at the same time, what this doesn't do is block those individual appeals. So that was Robert Jenrick's whole problem, wasn't it? He resigned last week because he said, what's the point in this if we still have this legal merry-go-round continuing ad infinitum? And unfortunately, I'm hearing that you're saying the legislation is robust, but you can't rule out these individual appeals either.
It may well be the case that any individual says that they should not be deported, but first of all, they have to produce evidence, and then it will be the decision for a minister, not for the courts, to decide whether or not that evidence is appropriate. And so it is very, very clear that this legislation will empower ministers to ensure that people can be deported. And it sends a very clear message to the courts, if passed, that Parliament wants to see some of the process that we've had and almost all of the objections that we've had swept away.
Back in 2015, you were the one who led the charge as Justice Secretary to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with the Bill of Rights. I mean, you've not ruled out leaving the ECHR. What's your position on all that now? Because arguably, had you scrapped the HRA and replaced it with a Bill of Rights, you might not be in this mess.
Well, it was the case at the time that I and my colleague Dominic Raab were seeking to update and modernise our human rights architecture and to make our human rights architecture more robust. It was, as a result of that, our intention to stay within the European Convention on Human Rights, but the Prime Minister has made clear that we will do whatever it takes in order to ensure that we can get people who need to be deported from our shores deported. This legislation does what it takes, and it keeps us within the boundaries of international law as well.
If it doesn't do what you want it to do, when you say that you'll do anything that it takes, what does that actually mean, Mr. Gove? What else would you do?
Well, I think this bill is enough. I think it's a very robust piece of legislation. Again, I think it's important to make sure that people understand what's in this bill. So I think close scrutiny and appropriate interrogation of the bill shows that, for example, there are significant sections of the Human Rights Act, significant aspects of the way in which the ECHR operates, which are disapplied in this legislation. And Parliament is clear. Parliament, if the bill is passed, Parliament is also clear that there are a number of conventions, some pretty, robust conventions on, for example, human trafficking and on the resettlement of individuals, which are completely put to one side as a result of this legislation. And I think it's important that people have a chance to read the black and white of the bill and to form their own judgment on that.
You know that people won't do that. They'll just get an impression of the bill and its efficacy if it actually works and they see flights take off to Rwanda. Let's talk about another piece of legislation that you've been involved in, the leasehold reform bill, Mr. Gove. Oh, go on. You're going to say that flights are going to take off when?
No, I'm just going to say that I do hope that people read the legislation because it is important. But you're absolutely right. The most important thing is making sure that flights do take off, and I'm sure they will. OK, if people do read the leasehold reform bill, your bill had promised to abolish the feudal leasehold system, but it doesn't actually abolish leaseholds. What happened to the bill? We make sure that leasehold effectively becomes a redundant form of property ownership in the way in which we've seen it in the past, and we empower people to take control of their own properties. So anyone who's in a leasehold flat will know that as the lease, the term that covers their ownership of the flat winds down, so the value of their home reduces. But we're altering that. So
you've had to add an amendment to the bill.
Can transform. The bill will be amended in order to ensure that we strengthen the freedoms that we're giving to people. But the essential part of the bill, everyone listening or watching who's a leaseholder should know, is that they can take full control of their flat. They can go for a 990-year lease. They can make sure that the negotiation is straightforward. They can get the full value of their property. And you can tell from some of the objections that are being made by the freeholders, i.e. by the property barons, that they will be losing out because individual leaseholders are going to be enfranchised and empowered. You can tell from their concern or opposition that this is actually a way of making sure that people who are leaseholders get full control of their flats.
Let's talk about housing, Mr. Gove, because we had that historically high legal migration figure, 745,000. We heard from Home Secretary James Cleverly in the week that he wants to reduce that by at least 300,000. That then leaves the potential for 450,000 people to come to Britain every year. That, as far as I can tell, is the population of Leeds. Therefore, we would have to be building at least 500,000 dwellings a year to keep up with migration, let alone to keep up with the population rate in this country in the first place. So the bottom line is here, you built 204,530 new dwellings in the year ending March 2022. You're nowhere near building enough houses.
Yes, we do need to build more homes, and yes, we do need to bring migration down. I think the measures that you referenced, that James introduced earlier this week, will bring figures down, and will bring figures down to levels that people would consider to be appropriate for our economy. But of course we do need to build more homes, and that's why later this week we should be publishing new planning rules which ensure that we can get more of the right homes in the right places. Talking of things in the right places, let me put this
Put that back in so you can hear me. I get that, but then, can you hear me, Mr. Gove? There we are. One last question.
I can, Camilla, sorry, yes.
Good man, thank you. One last question, though, very, very quickly. You're going to have a position again from the likes of Theresa Villiers and others that have been quite NIMBYist. Do these colleagues have to start being YIMBY, not NIMBY? Very briefly, Mr. Gove.
All Conservative colleagues are absolutely committed to making sure we have more of the right homes in the right places. They, like me, want to make sure that we protect our environment, protect our green belt, but also have the right sort of densification in particular parts of our cities in order to drive new homes for the next generation.
Mr. Gove, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Up next, we're going to be speaking to Ian Duncan-Smith. I'm also going to be discussing Dennis McShane's new book about New Labour. But before then, here's a news headline.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I. So you want higher taxes? Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Much more to come in the next hour. I'm going to be speaking to Tory grandee Ian Duncan-Smith, who'll be giving me his thoughts on the new Rwanda bill and Robert Jenrick's resignation. I'll also be joined by the Labour veteran Lord George Fawkes. All that and more after the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much and good morning. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Prime Minister is facing a fresh blow by members of his own party who say his Rwanda bill is not fit for purpose. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, Sir Bill Cash, who's chaired a legal examination on the policy, says the bill is not sufficiently watertight, meaning illegal migrants could begin prolonged legal challenges in an attempt to stay in the UK. Tories from both the right and the left had been waiting the findings, with MPs set to vote on the Rwanda bill this Tuesday. Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove told Camilla Tominey the legislation is absolutely robust.
There are all sorts of milk metaphors out there. This is Jersey gold top legislation because it is very clear that the basis on which people resisted being sent to Rwanda in the past, the justifications that were used then, will no longer apply. And I think the legal consensus is, particularly from people who have themselves sat on the Supreme Court, like Jonathan Sumption, that this legislation will ensure that there will only be a vanishingly small number of cases for individuals being able to resist being deported.
The Labour leader will warn the Prime Minister's party can no longer govern the country because warring camps are fighting like rats in a sack. In a speech on the same day as the scheduled vote on the government's Rwanda policy, he'll claim it's Labour that shares Britain's values. Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall told broadcasters this morning Labour would scrap the Rwanda plan in favour of a new scheme, including an elite cross-border force to stop illegal migration. Despite the pressures of over the £290 million policy that's been marred by legal challenges, the Prime Minister called on Labour to rise above political games and back his emergency legislation. The Mayor of London says the Met Police is chronically underfunded. In a letter to the Home Secretary, Sadiq Khan says London faces unique pressures as a capital city and urges the Home Office to boost the force's finances. He says the underfunding is highlighted by the challenge of policing the protests over the conflict in Gaza and Israel. Mr Khan warns the funding gap could now be as high as £240 million. And more heavy rain is expected as the second named storm of the weekend is set to sweep across the UK. Heavy rain is expected this evening as Storm Fergus sweeps eastwards, bringing 20 to 30 millimetres of rain with it, along with a risk of hail and thunder. Gusts will hit South Wales and areas around the Bristol Channel the hardest. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on your digital radio, and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now back to Camilla.
Thank you, Tatiana. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Still lots more to come. In just a minute, I'm going to be joined by the Labour peer George Fawkes. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith is going to be discussing Rwanda with me. Tory MP Dr Luke Evans will be speaking to me after a victory for his Buy British campaign. And GB News favourite, former Labour MP Dennis McShane will be discussing his new book. He'll run us through his diaries between 1997 and 2001. I'm joined now by Labour peer Lord George Fawkes, Labour MP between 1979 and 2005. Served as Minister of State for Scotland. Lord Fawkes, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you very much for joining me. Now, I know you're opposed to the government's...
Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. I know you're opposed to the government's Rwanda plan, but the big question on everyone's lips is what should Keir Starmer propose as an alternative to stop the boats?
Well, I think you've already heard in the news that Liz Kendall has repeated what has been suggested by Yvette Cooper, that we have an elite task force working with other countries. Of course, this is the third bill that we've had from, or two acts and now a bill from the Conservatives, each one supposedly going to solve the problem. And neither has solved the problem previously, and this one isn't either. I mean, It is a ridiculous bill. It's opposed. Robert Jenrick, who was the immigration minister, supposedly pushing this through, has resigned. Sir Bill Cash and his group of lawyers has said it isn't going to work. No one sensible and who understands this issue think it's going to work.
Yes. I mean, but is that it from Labour, an elite task force? I mean, there are already people working from Britain with the French on this. We're talking about trying to smash an international criminal network of people who are operating across borders. How on earth is an elite task force going to be able to stop 45,000 people from coming here illegally last year?
Well, we have to work across borders as well. But how is the Tories are in power. They've been in power for 13 years. And the illegal, as well as the legal immigration, has gone up and up and up, in spite of them saying, we now have control of our borders. We're no longer members of the European Union. We can do what we want. And yet they haven't been able to curb either legal or illegal immigration. And this crazy bill is the worst of all. I mean, they're trying to legislate in a United Kingdom bill that Rwanda is safe.
Yes.
And that just can't be done. It is crazy, absolutely crazy.
I mean, Rwanda itself and President Kagame will say that it is safe and that it's certainly a lot safer than it was. But you have concerns about Rwanda in 2023, do you?
Yes, and the Supreme Court had concerns about it. And that's why they expressed their concerns about the previous legislation.
Yeah.
And the government is now scrabbling to legislate and say, I mean, how can we legislate to say that any other country is safe?
Yes.
The other thing that we should be doing, Camilla, is that if we want to stop the economic migrants coming to the United Kingdom, we want to build up the countries that they're leaving. And yet we've cut down our overseas development spending from 0.7% to 0.5%. And most of that is being spent looking after people here in the United Kingdom that come from those countries.
Having said that, Lord Fawkes, have you got many Labour voters, particularly in red wall areas, clamouring for the foreign aid bill to be increased at a time of a cost of living crisis? Nobody's asking for that, are they?
Well, they'd rather, I think, money being spent in the countries than in the United Kingdom, in hotels, £8 million a day to put up people who have come here. It would be cheaper to keep them in their own countries, creating new employment that will keep them there and will put things that we might purchase from them. That's sensible. That's what we should be doing.
Isn't it fair, though, for people listening and watching this to think to themselves, well, hang on a minute, Labour haven't really got a leg to stand on when it comes to talking about immigration, legal or illegal, because under Tony Blair particularly, the numbers of people coming into the country rose exponentially. Labour's never had a problem with immigration. It's actively encouraged it. In fact, some people might look back to the new Labour administration and say that that's when the problem started in the first place. We've now got, I believe, 9 million more people here than when Tony Blair rose to power. Labour must take responsibility for that, surely.
No, Camilla, I understand that's your agenda and the GB agenda. GB News agenda. But the Tories have been in power for 13 years. They said now when we leave the European Union, we have control of our own borders. And nothing has happened. It's got worse and worse and worse. So don't go back to when Tony Blair was in power. Let's talk about the last 13 years, and particularly about the last few years, when the Tories have promised again and again and again that they're the party to deal with it. And if you look at the public opinion polls, you'll find that Labour is ahead on every issue, including immigration. The British people realise that the Tories have been a total failure. I mean, look now, we've got a Prime Minister who was beaten by Liz Truss even in an election to be leader. And he is completely incompetent. The sooner we have a general election, the better. The sooner we have a...
To be fair, Lord Fowkes, I'm not sure anybody in the Labour Party can talk about the appropriateness of leaders when Jeremy Corbyn was at the helm for 4 years. But I digress. When it comes, to this immigration issue, I'm not pushing an agenda. I'm not pushing an agenda, but I'm just saying it's difficult for people...
pushing an agenda. We all know that you and Camilla and GB News are pushing an agenda. And what you need to do is look at the current situation. Look at what the Tories are up to. They've been in power for 13 years. And it's about time that you and other people realised that and started challenging what they're doing instead of going back to generations ago.
Lord Fowkes, if I may, every government minister that comes on this show gets a very robust response from me on the failings of 13 years of Tory rule. We just had a newspaper review which was extremely critical of the government. My point really on immigration is, can Labour really be trusted when it says it wants to bring the numbers down, both legal and illegal, when under the last Labour administration, the numbers went up exponentially? That's not an agenda-setting question. It's just an honest question based on fact.
Well, it didn't go up exponentially. Your mathematics isn't all that good, Camilla. The position was that people who, in areas where we needed support, I mean, I was treated in hospital recently, and most of the people who helped me are people who looked after me, are people who came in from overseas. Our health service would be in real trouble if it hadn't been for doctors, for nurses, and for other people coming in. A whole range of our services, our care homes would be in difficulties without these people.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you.
Well, you didn't.
I'm merely saying that immigration went up under Labour. I mean, no, I'm not a mathematician. I'm a journalist, Lord Fowkes, so that makes me functionally enumerate, I can assure you. But at the same time, immigration went up under Labour. That's a fact.
But I'm saying that the surgeon who treated me, the nurse who looked after me, they were people who came in from other countries. Thank goodness they were there to look after me. And now we need to train more nurses, more doctors.
Okay.
But we've relied on many of these people coming in for years. And we still have to take account of that. But
all right, Lord Fowkes, thank you.
It's the uncontrolled economic migration. And that can be helped by building up these other countries, the economy of these other countries.
Lord Fowkes, thank you very much indeed. You've given us a robust view on Labour's position. Just for clarification with regard to whether it's an exponential rise or not, from 1997 to 2010, immigration quadrupled. I mean, again, I'm no, mathematician, but at the same time, that does seem like an exponential rise to me. Anyway, do not move a muscle, because in a minute, I'm going to be joined by former Tory leader Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. Is he planning to rebel against the government on Tuesday? We'll find out in just a jiffy.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Carson, this Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on this cold and windy Sunday morning. Don't go anywhere, because joining me in the studio is Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, Tory MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, former Conservative Party leader and co-founder and director of the Centre for Social Justice think tank, which is what you're in to talk to me about. First of all, Sir Ian, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you.
Morning.
Now, this report, this seminal report that the CSJ has released called Two Nations is on the front page of the Sunday Times. It's on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. It's got great coverage. The headlines, though, are very stark. COVID turned UK social divide into a chasm, says the Sunday Times. The Telegraph headline is "Lockdown had catastrophic effect on poverty gap." So what does this report tell us about Britain, Sir Ian?
Well, what it is very clear about is that the problems that have existed for a long time, which may even begun to be put right before COVID, but there are big gaps in society. You know, the poorest in society, the bottom 2 or 3 deciles, whose work is non-progressive quite often, who now feel it's better to be on welfare than it is to be back at work. Huge increases in sickness benefit claims, and yet in those claims, 700,000 people in a recent study we did want to go back to work, but they're fearful about how they get back to work. So there's been a big divide, but then COVID hit. And this is the big point about the report, which is, as I say, done by independent people like Martin Ivins, even the ex-governor of the Bank of England, Irving King, and even the Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham.
Yes.
So it's cross-party
Cross-party.
spectrum. And what this tells us is that nobody thought about what would happen when you try and shut an economy down, blanket shut down, about those who can't be shut down.
Yes.
So if you're, for example, a single mother living in a 12th story of a tower block with 2 kids, you have to go to work, often to do the books at Amazon that the middle classes were then reading happily in their gardens. They had to go to work, but the mayor shut the tubes down to a degree, so they were packed.
Yes.
And their kids were now off school, the group that was least likely to catch COVID, were being locked out of school. So now that mother is having to juggle the idea her kids are at school without the right facilities to go online and has to go to work to earn an income. No wonder then eventually she bails out. There are big mental health problems for the kids, and that's growing exponentially.
Yes, to use a word.
Exactly right, but they're in the schools. And then, following that, we've now got huge increase in ghost children. That is children that never came back to school after the lockdown. The government's trying to do stuff about it, but the lockdown literally drove them out of their schools. And these are kids in the poorest environment. They need the education. That's the best way out of poverty, but they're not there. Going into street gangs, big problems. This report, in specific terms, shows all of these features increase dramatically coming through the lockdowns. And the question, you know, it's a very good report because it gives an idea and we're going to put policy forward. But the second part of it is, what in heaven's name is this inquiry doing at the moment?
That's right.
This is the issue that we should really be dealing with. Did anybody think seriously, what are the scientists that told us we had to lock down a blanket of dodgy forecasts that were all wrong?
Yeah.
We panicked. I can understand right at the beginning, but 2 more lockdowns and the schools was a disaster for this country, and we are still picking up the pieces. It's divided society dramatically. That's what the report says.
Yes.
And now the big focus has to be how you put that right.
I mean, the report is discovering things that the COVID inquiry should look at. Instead, the COVID inquiry seems to be concerned with what Dominic Cummings said to Matt Hancock and what Boris Johnson thought about it. Is the COVID inquiry in its current form fit for purpose?
Well, I'm astonished, you know, that what's been going on for a year and a half of this inquiry, I must say, because all along at the CSJ, we've been asking this question: what about the poorest in society? Who asked about them? Who's looking at what they're doing? Which is why this report has been produced.
Yeah.
We're going to come forward with what has to be done, because things do have to be done. But lots of stuff happened in the period. I can understand that we've never been in this situation before, huge pressures. But once we began to understand who this affected, it didn't affect young people. It didn't affect children. It was about comorbidities and older people. Well, then you set your policy accordingly to deal with that. What we carried on doing was these blanket lockdowns under the punishing direction from many of the scientists who considered this is absolutely the case, we had to do it. Hospitals were half empty, by the way.
Yes.
People having cancer treatment couldn't get into the hospitals, yet there were empty beds there because they were worried about COVID.
That's all
real
things that the
issues.
inquiry
So
should look
this
at.
inquiry that we've carried through is all about what went wrong and how bad is it now in society, and it is definitely very divided.
Before we get on to the government and indeed the Tory party's problems, one last question on that, because there's a stark line in the report. It's 300 pages long. I do recommend people look at it because it's so comprehensive. It's what the inquiry should be doing and isn't doing. But there's a line in there about, you know, Britain is sick, but being sick pays. And you were the architect of universal credit as the Secretary of State for the Department for Work and Pensions. It must depress you to find in your own think tank's report this idea that people are feeling better off on welfare than in work. We know that there are some people who simply cannot work. They are either disabled, they have got circumstances beyond their control, they might be caring for an ill child, an ill parent, and all the rest of it. But this statistic of people who could work but choose not to must depress you particularly.
It does. Universal Credit's done a huge amount to get people back to work, and it was working really, really well as we ran into COVID. The problem is once you take off all the restrictions, all the conditionality, etc., which happened, then people will drift, as they did, towards those elements. One of the biggest problems they've got, of course, is most of the sickness benefit elements are not in universal credit.
Yeah.
So many of the long-term sick are still now outside of any of that support or assistance that would come if they were in universal credit. The second part about this is, on the disability front, the government actually had got a good record, more people in work who had disabilities. But one of the polls that we did in a run to this was to ask the question, how many of those who are on sickness benefit actually genuinely want to work? Over 700,000 said we would want to work, but were scared stiff about how it goes about, whether or not we get prosecuted, what happens next. So the complexity has also now trapped them. We want them out of that, and all of that sickness benefit should be in universal credit right now. There shouldn't be people languishing outside the support and help that you can get to get them back to work, to deal with their conditions, to help get the remedial treatment that is necessary. That is critical, and that has to be done.
So you're going to be making policy recommendations to the government, which hopefully they will listen to on the back of this report. Let's just talk about the Rwanda plan, can we? Because you've been linked to this star chamber of lawyers. Your colleague in the House, Sybil Cash, is among those people saying that they don't think this legislation is robust enough. We've had Michael Gove on with me this morning saying that it is gold-top Jersey milk proof legislation. That's how robust he thinks it is. He thinks it's a top-level bill that won't, you know, sort of let through any seepage, so to speak. What's your view and how are you going to vote on Tuesday?
Well, I've said all along, I just wait to see what the lawyers come up with in terms of how they interpret this.
I mean, they're
I think,
saying
you know,
that it's not foolproof.
Well, I don't know, because my view at the moment is there are good bits in it, and the government has moved a long way to try and head off what I call vexatious, constant court cases. So there's good stuff in it, and it's a good attempt to do this. The question is whether, on the margins, that brings the exact results or unexpected consequences. And so I've held my own counsel.
So you can't tell me today that you're going to vote with the government?
Because I said I want to see what the final report of these lawyers is, people I respect, by the way, like Martin Howe and Bill Cash, etc., on constitutional work and European work. The key question is, have we done enough? Now, Lord Sumption thinks they have. So it'd be interesting to see what the juxtaposition of that with the Lord Sumptions is. And so most of my colleagues, constantly, it's not for me to tell them what to do. I just simply recommend don't leap before you see exactly what it is in front of you.
But that sounds to me that you might be veering towards abstention if you're not happy rather than rebellion. I mean, the government is on the ropes. It's not going to be helpful for people like you, senior politicians in the party, a former leader, to rebel on this, is it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, which is why I'm keeping my counsel on this. And my view is you can't always have perfection. But the question is, have you gone far enough to make sure that essentially you're able to do what the public wants, which is to get these flights off the ground to Rwanda? That's the key test, with people on it that disincentivises those who are paying huge sums of money and
But do you think you're going to see a flight depart from this country to Rwanda between now and the next general election?
I think we have to.
But do you think it's credible?
I think it is wholly feasible for that to happen.
Because Jenrick's opinion seems to be, you know, they're doing this all for show and they're not really being real about it, and it's kind of electioneering rather than actually going to make a difference.
My general view to everybody, my colleagues, is speak softly and carry a big stick. The truth is, we do a lot of shouting at the moment, and I wish we'd stop shouting and just literally discuss these things in a reasonable way, because at the end of it all, we have one purpose, all of us, which is we want to get these flights off because they will discourage those paying huge monies and being literally likely to die out in the Channel. That has to stop. It would be really good if we made sure that, as far as we possibly can, that is achievable. That is surely the only thing that matters.
I know you've got a fight on your hands for Chingford and Woodford Green because you're on a 1,200-seat majority, which is obviously quite slim. You've also got, to your party, the threat from reform. Just briefly, Nigel Farage currently in the jungle. People need to vote for him to be crowned king of the jungle tonight. Is that a credible threat, do you think, to the Conservative Party, the idea of Nigel Farage getting back involved at the helm of reform and taking the Tories on?
Well, you never know what Nigel is going to do next. I mean, one moment he's doing GB News, the next minute he's getting covered in insects and various other things in the jungle. My general sense is that we, as a Conservative Party, have to deal with threats from whatever flanks they come from by being properly Conservative and delivering on what we said we would do at the last election. We said we'd get us out of Europe. We did. We said we would start to pull back on migration, which we must do. I think we will begin to. And we did say, Rishi Sunak said he would stop the boats. So if you make a pledge like that, you have to deliver on it. It's as simple as that. And I believe if we get these things clear, we are a party of government. And I think Reform is a protest party. You can't govern out of protest, but what you can do is make sure you deal with that protest by getting the policy right, which is critical about this Rwanda votes thing.
Would you ever go into the jungle, Syrian?
I've been in a jungle now for 32 years, full Parliament, and frankly, that is worse than any insect bites you can possibly have, let me tell you.
What a great final answer. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you very much indeed for coming in and joining me. If you want to have a look at that report, it's on the Centre for Social Justice website, so do check it out. Let's speak to Michael Portillo now, who's been listening into this intently. What I'm interested in with regard to Nigel in the jungle, and by the way, don't forget that there is that QR code popping up on the screen as we are broadcasting this morning to encourage you to vote, and you can use all of your 5 votes to make sure that Nigel Farage is crowned King of the Jungle later. I ask you because you have made the segue very successfully from politics to television and obviously opened yourself up to a much wider audience with all of the programming that you've done in the past, Michael. Does it make a difference to Nigel Farage's political standing for him to do well in a reality show? Does it translate? Is he a more credible threat to the Conservatives now after this experience in this reality show, do you think?
I think up to a point. But more importantly, I think, is the context of what has happened while he's been in the jungle. I think we've just passed through a really important week in British politics because the disagreement between Robert Janrick and the Prime Minister illustrates that at least Janrick, and by the way, Suella Braverman and others, think that there is more that can be done on immigration than is being put forward in this bill. The Labour Party, of course, doesn't want to do anything about Rwanda at all.
No.
So the British public sees that the Labour Party wants to do nothing, and many people in the Conservative Party think that it's not doing all that it can. That, to me, provides the condition in which reform does very well. I think reform will now begin to take off. I think many Tories will take this as evidence that their own party is not doing what they wish it to do. And we can now see the salience of the immigration issue. It ranks above the cost of living in polls. People want something to be done. And we can also see from the polls that people do not believe that this policy is going to be effective. So Nigel will come out of the jungle in a situation where reform is going to do great damage to the Conservative Party and will provide him with a great platform. On the other hand, of course, if Nigel goes with reform, and reform does do great damage to the Conservative Party, as I think it will, that cuts off another route for him, which is to return to the Conservative Party, where, were he to become elected as a Member of Parliament, I think he would rise through the ranks.
Yes.
Let's just put all that in one further context. The Conservatives will not be the next government. So even if Nigel does penetrate the Conservative Party, he's not going to find himself in power.
Before I ask you who you've got coming up on your show at 11, let's just have a look at a little clip of Nigel taking part in the celebrity cyclone last night. It's from last night's episode. I mean, check this out. It's quite remarkable, to be honest. Have a look. In some respects, this isn't politics, is it? It's entertainment, but there you have it. And if you want to make Nigel King of the Jungle, you can just scan the QR code, as I said earlier, on the screen, or go to gbnews.com. Before we go, Michael Portillo, what have you got coming up on your show at 11?
Well, we're certainly going to debate the COVID inquiry. I think Ian was raising some very important questions about that. We're going to be talking to the Israeli Defence Forces about what is going on in their campaign against Hamas. More cheerfully, we're going to be looking at 2 productions of The Nutcracker in London, and I'm going to be eating some Christmas cake, which during the course of my interview is going to be fed. And I think being fed means being fed with alcohol, if I understand correctly.
All right, well, do save some for the rest of the staff. Ian, stick around, because there will be Christmas pudding a little later. Don't go anywhere for now, because I'm going to be speaking to the Tory MP, Dr Luke Evans, who's won a campaign for a supermarket to put the labels on food to say that it is being grown and made in Britain. And what's wrong with that? So stay tuned for that in just a moment. I'll be back before you know it.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I. So you want higher taxes? Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Thank you for joining me this morning. I'm going to speak to Dennis McShane about his brilliant new book, Labour Takes Power, in just a moment. But first of all, Dr. Luke Evans joins me. He's the Tory MP for Bosworth. Dr. Evans, lovely to see you this morning. Tell me about your Buy British campaign. This sounds like a thoroughly good idea that the GB News audience would be well behind.
Camilla, lovely to see you. And it's really simple. What we're simply asking for is that supermarkets online have a tab that's Buy British. At the moment, if you click onto any online supermarket, you could hit a Christmas button and have a collection of all Christmas stuff. Yet, we don't have that when it comes to buying British. Now, many of the farmers want to see that, and many of my constituents and across the country want to buy homegrown local produce. So my campaign is simply asking that supermarkets implement this as a way of quickly finding the food that's been grown, homegrown here in Britain.
And you've had some joy already with the campaign, because I think Morrison's are the first supermarket to sign up. So what have they agreed to do?
Yeah, it's been brilliant. So I wrote an open letter to all supermarkets with 121 MPs from across the House signing up to support it. The government backed it in September. We wrote off to all the supermarkets. The only one that's come back supportively is Morrison's. And they've said, yep, we love the idea. The new CEO said it's great. And they've implemented a Buy British tag. So if you go now to do your fruit and veg shop or your British meat shop, there's a tab there. You can hit that. There are 94 items and counting on there. So my simple question is, where next? Well, asking the other supermarkets, if Morrison's can do it, why can't you?
And has this come in a kind of post-Brexit environment where British farmers have been saying to you, because I know you're in a quite rural constituency there, that they need this extra boost? I mean, how did it come about in the first place, and what's the reaction of the farming community to it?
Camilla, you're spot on. So this came out from being out with my farmers, talking to them, saying, what can the government do? Is it more about subsidies? Is it about tax breaks? And a couple of them just stopped me and said, look, what we really need people to do is just buy British. If they bought British stuff, we can then have better food security, it's better for the environment, and it gives people better choice. So I went away and thought, well, what's the best way to do that? And then wrote the letter. It turns out the NFU have been campaigning for this since about 2016 and 2017. So I've just piggybacked on the work with them. And since that's been happening, we've had a petition with 27,000 people and counting sign up to say, look, this is a good idea. Why don't supermarkets do it more often?
I mean, how is the farming community after Brexit? We do hear sort of scare stories that farmers aren't happy, that they're worried about trade deals with other countries, not least the likes of New Zealand and America, with regard to undercutting us when it comes to importing meat. I mean, what's the general feeling among the farmers that you're speaking to in Bosworth?
Well, there's always concerns, but they're very keen to point out the quality, the standards for husbandry we have here, the standards for animal welfare is some of the best in the world. It's the quality we have. So there's a real opportunity there, actually, to be exporting our stuff across the world. So these trade deals really help. Yes, there is a risk that you could be undercut, but I think the British produce stands on its own 2 feet, which is why when I asked the farmers, they said buy British because it does all that for us. That helps our food security as well as the environment as well. And so I think it's a win-win-win. Now, it's not for everyone. Not everyone can afford that. But I'm not saying that. I'm simply arguing that people get choice.
While I have you, Dr. Evans, do you mind if I ask you a few sort of party and government-related questions? I'm intrigued to know, for instance, how you plan to vote on the Rwanda bill on Tuesday. There's lots of stories in the newspapers about potential rebellions on both left and right of the party. I just spoke to Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, who is sort of mulling it all over. Where do you stand on that legislation?
I thought you might ask me this question, Camilla. I will be supporting the government with their position. I simply take a pragmatic view at this. You've got on one side of the party, the left saying this has gone too far. On the other side, the right saying it hasn't gone far enough. And the government lawyers saying this is the right way to deal with it. Now, we're working through a process. To me, what happens if we don't get this in place as a deterrent? Labour don't have a policy, so nothing's going to change. And my constituents want to see illegal immigration stopped. This is our best chance of doing it. Now, I particularly note what Rwanda have said on this. Their foreign minister has turned around and said, but we will only support this in line with Britain following international law. So we've got to remember, if this doesn't go through, then there's going to be a great big hole and the whole scheme falls down. So for me, it's purely a pragmatic decision. I follow the likes of David Davis, who says, yeah, look, that we want to make sure this gets sorted, and this is our best chance of ensuring that, because, God forbid, Labour don't have a plan to deliver it.
And when you speak to people on the doorstep, I would imagine that they do express concerns about the boats, but also about the legal migration figure, which hit a record high of 745,000 towards the end of 2022. But are they necessarily championing Rwanda as a plan? I mean, you're quite a level-headed Tory MP who may well have reacted to the idea of processing migrants overseas positively and then be told that we're going to do it ... in a Rwanda, and said to yourself, Rwanda, really? Is that the best place to do it?
Well, I think we already see the UN, according to the Daily Mail, sending people to Rwanda, refugees to be supported. I think the key thing is we've proved Denmark has legislation that allows for offshoring for people in third countries to be processed. It's a deterrent. We don't want people getting into that system in the first place. But I like to think if I was a political refugee, if it meant that I had to be processed in another country to be able to get where I wanted to be, I would go through that. But we want people to come through the legal routes. And I think, what's lost in these net migration figures legally is that actually one of the best exports we have is our university and our education system. The key thing is that people were bringing their families along and staying further than we wanted them to do. That's a reasonable question. I want to export our university, our education across the world, but I also want to be able to have the services here provided to the public that meet the standards that they expect. And that's the balance we're looking at. It's the sheer numbers of people coming through. So we need to stop illegal migration and then deal with legal migration in a way that is still beneficial to the country, but also allows us to export across the world as well.
Now, I note that you won the Patchwork Conservative MP of the Year for campaigning on body image following your work as a GP, where you saw, quotes, firsthand the negative impact that social media platforms and false advertising can have on a person's relationship with their body. You're also very good on social media. You're a TikTok user, notwithstanding the concerns about Chinese spying. And you are quite good, actually, to be fair to you, Dr. Evans, at sort of connecting with younger voters. Finally, do you think the Tories have got a problem with younger voters? Sometimes the idea of a young Conservative seems slightly oxymoronic.
Well, look, it's a great way. Each MP has to find a way in which they can connect. And I heard you talking before about Nigel Farage being out on I'm a Celebrity, and a chance to connect in a different way to a different audience. And that's what my job is here as an MP, to find ways to connect to people. For me, it's being on TikTok is the one thing I get stopped up and down the country for, to say you're the MP on TikTok. And you do it in a style that educates people to say what goes on behind the system, because a lot of people get fed up with the process and the party political stuff. So understanding why decisions are made, and often both sides of the argument, I think is really important. And if I can play a part in doing that, that's what I did as a doctor, that's what I'm doing as a politician, I think it can really help. So I've found a niche. It's not for everyone. Not everyone goes into the jungle, but I think we've got to have horses for courses.
Dr. Luke Evans, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Good luck with your Buy British campaign.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to see you. Now I'm joined in the studio by former Labour MP Dennis McShane. He's the author of a new book. Let's have a look at it. Labour Takes Power, the Dennis McShane Diaries, 1997 to 2001. Dennis, lovely to see you. Now, I know you're very familiar to GB viewers and indeed listeners. This book puts you at the very heart of a very exciting time, I would imagine, in your political career. And I was wondering, on election night, when you think back to that moment in 1997, what's the sort of overriding memory that you have of Tony Blair taking power in quite sensational fashion?
Fear. In the sense that we knew we were going to win, we knew Tony was going to win, but I just worked in European politics. By the way, I love Luke's idea of buy British. I'm old enough to remember Robert Maxwell launching a giant campaign to buy British. But you go to any French supermarket and they all have big signs saying this produce is produced not in France but locally. So to have a Tory MP copying a great French idea, nothing wrong with that at all. Anyway, on this, 1997,
yes.
I just was uncertain whether Tony, who's an excellent leader, but he'd never had any government experience, nor had Gordon Brown, nor had Robin Cook, with whom I was beginning to work in the Foreign Office, would have that experience of what to do. But I was very pleasantly surprised. They came up with a lot of very, very good ideas which corresponded to what the country felt. For example, abolishing all the Tory anti-gay laws. I mean, it's literally unbelievable, Camilla, to think that in 1997 you still could be in trouble in some areas if you were gay. We got rid of all of that.
Although the Tories would take credit for gay marriage.
Lots and lots of other things. And I just decided earlier on, when I came into the by-election in 1994, I would keep a diary as a kind of witness. So every day a little notes, then the evening dictated, then driving up to the constituency on Friday very early in the morning, dictating more, transcribing, so all of it's contemporaneous.
Yes.
A lot of diaries are written, sometimes written by guys on the Daily Mail or wherever for their principals. These are real accounts of what it was like. And then as you read through it, there are two or three big takeaways for me. Number one, very early on, tensions between the two big beasts, as it were, Team Blair and Team Brown.
When you say early on, what do you mean in 1997? I mean, I like this quote that you give. The book talks about, quotes, personal rivalries, slights and petty jealousies between the party's big beasts. I mean, give us some examples. Were Blair and Brown at each other's throats from the very beginning, or...?
It basically, Tony thought, like Margaret Thatcher, or even if you like Edward Heath, we should engage pretty fully with Europe. I don't think it was Gordon himself. Gordon, before he became Chancellor, I knew him on the European circuit, was much more seen as the Labour Party's Mr. Europe at the time. But the Treasury blob always hated sharing power with any other country in
You
Europe.
refer to Treasury officials as maggots.
Well, I mean...
Slightly harsh, Dennis, but what are you saying? What are you saying about Treasury officials? Because this seems to be a problem that faced Liz
It's
Truss.
the blob.
Still
It's
facing...
the blob. It is. It's what Hazlitt in the 19th century called the thing.
Yeah.
You always have this established wisdom of the permanent functionaries. In other countries, they change them. Nobody pretends in France or in Germany a civil servant doesn't have a political point of view, so they rotate a bit more. Here we have these guys who come out of Winchester and Eton, put into the Foreign Office after Oxford, into the civil service after Oxford or Cambridge, and then stay there, just clocking up their gongs until they die. and that was part of the problem. The other difficulty was that the Conservative Party, I still don't quite know how it happened. William Hague was a very intelligent man. He came from Rotherham. I knew his family, where I was the MP. And yet he decided the way to trip up Blair was to make the Tory party a UKIP party. UKIP wasn't invented by then. Nigel, I think, was elected a few years later. But already... every day almost in the Commons, William Hague was giving in to Bill Cash. Once again, we see Bill Cash this morning.
Bill Cash.
Back, he's eternal.
For many
he's
decades,
eternal.
Although he's standing down at the next general election.
So that was a problem. But where Blair was lucky in a big majority, so there were rebellions, huge rebellions in the first few months on lone parents.
Yes.
People, you might remember them technically.
I was at university in this era, but yes,
all
I
right.
do vaguely remember.
They were the big issues. There was a left that couldn't quite coalesce around a leader. I mean, Tony Benn was there causing the eternal mischief that Tony always
the left were
called.
horrified at the idea of this Thatcherite new Labour leader at the end of the day.
Yeah, except I remember talking to one of Lionel Jospin. He was the French Prime Minister, the Socialist Prime Minister, who came in at exactly the same time, the summer of 1997, and talking to Alain Bourguignon, who's one of their big intellectuals, and he said, Dennis, well, he said in French, so I shouldn't do a silly French accent. He said, you know, the big difference is that Lionel Jospin talks left and acts right. With Blair, it's the other way round.
Yes.
So all this pro-business, sub-Thatcherite, some things like secret ballots for trade unions she brought in was commonplace in Europe 20, 30 years before. Only our stupid unions didn't see that. But what then that meant was that Tony, by giving that impression, actually could get a lot of investment, 20,000 more cops on the street, Sure Start for children, lots of other things, huge amounts of extra cash, becoming a bit later, not here, on for the NHS.
Presumably
people
that's
thought
why
this was
trying to channel his inner Thatcher as well at the moment. He's given an op-ed in the Sunday Telegraph last weekend which said that he admired Thatcher. Let me just stop you there, just because I want to fit in these anecdotes about the death of Princess Diana, which are really interesting.
Yes, indeed.
So your diaries reflect that you phoned Robin Janvrin, the Queen's Deputy Private Secretary. You say, I told him that if the royals were not down in London by tomorrow, this is in the aftermath, of course, of Diana's death on August the 31st, 1997 in Paris. You said if the royals are not down in London by tomorrow, there will be a republic by the weekend. And an exaggeration, but not by much. You really said that to Janvrin, and what was his response?
His response was, I know, Dennis, I know. I keep trying to... You can't get through to them. I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent, gifted public servant, an ex-Foreign Office diplomat who loved the Queen. I know that, served her. He was then, I think, her press officer and assistant private secretary. But I just came down from my constituency, where I'd been there with my children, and the horrible story arrived. And I came down to London, and I saw, where I live in Pimlico, these mounds of flowers outside a little curry shop. There's a picture of Diana. She runs past it in a muslin gauze dress when 10 years previously. But then what was happening at Buckingham Palace, the flag wasn't coming down. The Daily Mail were phoning up saying, have you got any comment on the Queen not flying the royal flag in a sign of mourning? I said, no, forget, I'm not doing red to quote on that. And I just said, you could palpably feel the anger at the royal family, because as constituted then, Charles, who dumped Diana pretty brutally, gone off with an old girlfriend. OK, she didn't forget that. That's 30 years ago. The Queen, unable to respond to the grief of the nation. And I was actually politically frightened. I mean, Tony came out, talked about the People's Princess,
yes,
and Friends and the Tory side phoned me up. My God, this is his Thatcher moment. This is his Falklands moment. This is when he represents the nation. So yeah.
But the Queen did come out in the end. She gave that remarkable televised address where she spoke both as your Queen and as a grandmother.
Yes.
I mean, subsequently, I think there have been sort of Peter Morgan-esque depictions of all this that Tony Blair was dictating this speech.
No.
That's not how it happened.
No.
She came out with those words.
I don't know. I've got other Queen stories, other people from Downing Street up in Balmoral stories. That's for another time. No, I mean, I'm sure somebody wrote it for her, and they were very moving
But it wasn't Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell.
Good God, no. No. But the words were found, and it did come down. It always sort of does come down every time we think the royal family is in trouble, probably since 1649 when the king lost his head somewhere on Whitehall. The royal families have been in trouble. So what they've done is send for a new one from Germany, or they've renewed the stock by bringing in a sort of handsome Greek officer. And they find a way out.
They find a way through, and they did find a way through. Just briefly to end, I mean, you'll have seen some of the coverage in this morning's newspapers. Professor Sir John Curtis is talking about electoral oblivion for the Conservatives. They might be down to 130 seats. Do you believe that? Because I can understand huge amounts of disaffection with the Conservative Party, and I think apathy is the enemy right now. Are they all champing at the bit to elect Keir Starmer Prime Minister as they were Tony Blair?
If you read early on in the book, Peter Mandelson writes an article saying the Conservatives could be out of power forever. And I just say, oh, please, Peter, this is hubris. This is silly and it's stupid. The Conservative Party have been coming back for 250 years. Every time you think they're out, they'll come back. They won't come back with bringing in the clown from the jungle, to be honest.
We must be voting for him. So
Nigel Farage is a friend of mine.
Yes,
I like him.
Voting for him, Dennis?
I dare say, and he's your presenter, and I love him dearly. But the reason he was rejected 7 times when he tried to be an MP, the nation loves him as a clown attacking Europe, but in charge of any law that affects us, no thanks. So,
very possibly. So the Tories will have a bad, just to finish, Dennis, they'll have a bad election, but not total wipeout.
I don't think so. And then it'll be the big question is, what do they do afterwards? If they go further right, then they'll be out for another 5 years. But the Tories are not over. OK, Dennis McShane, thank you very much for coming in today. Let's just give another plug to the book, Dennis McShane's Diary, Labour's Peaks Power, and it covers that period from 1997 to 2001. Well, that's it for me for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to be back next week at 9:30. Up next, it's Michael Portillo.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, welcome to your latest GB News weather. I'm Ellie Glazier. Low pressure still very much in charge of our weather, bringing some spells of wet and windy conditions moving in from the west. This one in particular spreading its way north and eastwards as we go through this morning. This bringing some very heavy rainfall to parts of Wales, southwest England, and then spreading into northern England and Scotland later. This rain falling on some already very saturated ground, so we could see some localised flooding through Sunday. Despite that rain, though, across northern parts of the UK, there will be some brightness across parts of Wales and southwest England, where temperatures likely to reach around 13 or 14 degrees. But with a strong southwesterly wind, that will take a notch off those temperatures. Through Sunday evening, further rain pushes in from the west, particularly across Northern Ireland, into Wales and northern England as we head through the early hours of Monday morning. Again, this rain falling on that very saturated ground, so some localised flooding possible. There will be some clear skies around, particularly across the southern half of the UK, where temperatures around 7 or 8 degrees, but under all that cloud and rain, temperatures dropping around 2 to 4 degrees here. A cloudy start for many of us on Monday, and quite a wet start across parts of Scotland too. Rain continues to push in from the east, perhaps turning wintry over any hills of Scotland. But the best of the sunshine on Monday, definitely across parts of Wales and southern England. Temperatures here a little bit above average for the time of year, around 10 to 12 degrees, but across parts of Scotland, generally around average in the mid to low single figures.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just